Hey folks, so today we're going to look at right mindfulness, which is the seventh aspect of the Eightfold Path. Coming right up. Hey folks, so I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're interested in helping to create a wiser, a kinder, and a less stressed out world, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll have discussions of aspects of Buddhism, early Buddhism such as these, secular Buddhism. We'll talk a little bit about related topics, and all kinds of extras from time to time. So if you're interested in that, consider subscribing. It won't cost you anything, and yeah, maybe you'll like it. So right mindfulness, the seventh aspect of the Eightfold Path, one of the most important aspects, especially nowadays when mindfulness has become such a big deal. Now, I was looking at, sort of the aspects of mindfulness, and there are many, many of them. It's such a huge topic, it's impossible to get it all across in one relatively short kind of lecture. So what I'm going to try to do, at least in this, is to sketch out the outlines here. And at the end, I'll give you a couple of books that, for those of you who are interested, you can look to them for a bit more depth here. And of course, in future lectures or videos, I may get into other aspects of this, maybe split some of them apart, depending on interest and so on. So there are four bases to mindfulness practice. The Satipatthana Sutta is where the practice comes from in the early texts. At least that's sort of the locus classicus, I was going to say, the important locus, the place you find it. It's probably the earliest detailed treatise on doing meditation that we know of. There are earlier mentions of meditation in certain kinds of Brahminic texts, but nothing with this kind of depth. So there are four aspects. Now, the first of these is the body, mindfulness of the body. Second is mindfulness of feelings. And feelings here is a technical term. It doesn't mean the same thing we do in English, feelings. The third is mindfulness of mind. And the fourth is called mindfulness of Damas, and I'll get into what that is as well when we get to it. Okay, so first a little side note about sati, the word in Pali that is translated as mindfulness in English. Strictly speaking, the word sati means memory. It's related to the word smriti in Sanskrit. And so we should think of sati or mindfulness as involving memory. Now, exactly how it involves memory is something of a controversy. Some people think that it involves our remembering to think in a certain way, or to act in a certain way, or to remember to do the kinds of practices involved. I believe that Analayo, who is a very great scholar of the early tradition, thinks that it's related to memory in helping us to remember. But in any event, so the first of the four aspects of mindfulness is mindfulness of body, and this is probably the one we know the best if we've done any kind of meditation practice, because the first part of mindfulness of the body is mindfulness of breathing. We're mindful of the breath as it enters the body, as it leaves the body. That's a mindfulness of body. We're also aware of the posture of the body, when we're sitting and when we're standing, or when we're sleeping, or that is to say, lying down. So that's another aspect. Now, but these are aspects that we can be immediately aware of through the body, through proprioception, through feeling. But there are other aspects of mindfulness of the body that are more conceptual. In the suttas, the Buddha talks about being mindful of the parts of the body, in particular the interior parts, being mindful not only of the exterior, the legs and the arms, let's say, but the heart and the lungs and the liver and the digestive organs and the stomach and so on. Things that we're not going to be aware of necessarily by proprioception or touch. We're also supposed to be aware of the elements of the body, the elements that go into making up the body. This is a great way of sort of understanding our relationship to the universe, because the elements in our body are shared with the outside world. They come in through food, they're excreted, and so on. So this is part of an awareness that helps us break down the boundaries between inside and outside. But again, this is a conceptual enterprise at this particular part of mindfulness, because we're not aware of the part of these elements necessarily directly. I mean, of course, some of them we may be, but some of them we may not. And in a related sense, we're supposed to be aware of death and decay. And this is related to what are called charnel ground contemplations. The monks in the Buddhist day would go to charnel grounds, that is to say, in ancient India, when people died, they were oftentimes put out in what are called charnel grounds, places where either they would be burned or they would be left for vultures to eat. These are great places where monks could watch the process of decay directly. And the point of the meditation related to charnel ground is to think of yourself in that respect, that you too, that I too will be that way. I too will be like this dead body here. I too will be these bleached bones on the ground. Now these may sound to us kind of awful contemplations. They may sound kind of disgusting maybe, but I think they're very, very important, both from a conceptual sort of spiritual sense, but also from a psychological sense, to become aware of death. And oftentimes in the West, it's said that death becomes very sterilized, that death happens somewhere else. It happens out of view for most of us. It happens in a different room. And that becoming aware of it directly may help us to make our peace with it when the time comes. And in all these cases, we're supposed to contemplate these things without any kind of desire or discontent with regard to the world, is what it says. That is to say, we're not supposed to desire the state of affairs or be discontented about the state of affairs. We're supposed to, if we're in the best possible state of mind with regard to these things, be in a state of something like equanimity with regard to these states or processes. We're supposed to contemplate them internally and externally. That is to say, contemplate them within our own body, as happening to us, as being the parts of us, as being our posture, as being our breath, and contemplate them externally. Now, what exactly that means is something of a question, but it may mean contemplating them in other people, for example. It might mean contemplating ourselves, but from the outside, from the third person perspective, as it were, seeing us as somebody else might. Again, this is more of a contemplative enterprise, a conceptual enterprise. We're supposed to contemplate their arising and their passing. So, for example, the breath. When the breath comes in, we contemplate the arising of the in-breath and the passing of the in-breath. The arising of the out-breath, the passing of the out-breath. To see these things arise and pass is to help us become aware of their temporary nature. And we're supposed to contemplate them, that is, independent, without clinging to them, without identifying with them, without thinking of them as mine, as I, as me, but just thinking of them as processes, as objective, as it were, objective kinds of processes, of experiences, of features of our own future if it comes to death and decay, and so on. And these aspects of internal and external, of arising and passing, and of non-clinging, this is part of what's called the refrain, the mindfulness refrain. It is something that's repeated again and again in the sutta with respect to each of the different aspects. So it's not just about the mindfulness of the body, but we're supposed to hold that in mind with all of the other aspects that we contemplate when doing mindfulness meditation. Now, the second part of mindfulness, the second aspect of mindfulness, foundation of mindfulness, if you like, is mindfulness of feelings. This is not feelings in the sense of English of feeling great or feeling happy. This is feelings in the sense of pleasant feelings, neutral feelings, and unpleasant feelings. And this kind of contemplation is extremely important for the Buddha, for Buddhist practice in general, because it's through positive feelings that attachment arises. And it's through negative feelings that negative emotions arise. Emotions of rejection, emotions of anger, ill will. So being aware of these arising and passing of pleasant and unpleasant states is extremely important. We're also supposed to become aware, and this is more of I would say, an advanced practice, to become aware of worldly and unworldly, pleasant and unpleasant feelings and neutral feelings. And what is that distinction, worldly and unworldly? Well, the worldly feelings are really the ones we think about all the time. A pain in the leg, a pleasant memory, somebody coughing next to us, something like that. Those are all worldly pleasant or unpleasant feelings. Unworldly pleasant feelings are awareness of wisdom arising in us, awareness of equanimity arising in us. That kind of happiness, that kind of pleasant feeling is a pleasant feeling, but it's an unworldly pleasant feeling. It's not something that from the Buddhist standpoint really can become attached to. Or we could, but it's more difficult perhaps. I'm not That may be a question for the Abhidharma to answer, and I'm not really sure. But in any event, it certainly is much, much less of a problem. And unworldly, unpleasant feelings might be, again, the awareness of our own ignorance. This is something that I know I feel a lot of the time, and perhaps you do as well. And to be aware that that's not an unpleasant feeling in the same way that remembering an auto accident that we were in or something like that is an unpleasant memory, or a pain in the leg is an unpleasant feeling. Again, these are worldly. The unworldly unpleasant feeling has to do more with our practice and the way that it's impacting us, and the way that we see ourselves either succeeding in practice or, as it were, failing in getting to the final goal. And of course, as many of us will know, we have to be very careful with these kinds of thoughts. We don't want to become too filled with effort towards the pleasant unworldly and in opposition to the unpleasant unworldly, because that can also get in our own way. Now, the third aspect of mindfulness meditation, or foundation of mindfulness, is mindfulness of mind. Mindfulness of the quality of our own mind. And this is more like the feeling, the English word feeling might connote. That is, we're supposed to be aware of when our mind is filled with greed, to be aware when our mind is angry, to be aware when our mind is constricted onto a particular kind of thing that we're annoyed about, or that's limiting our perspective, and to be aware when our mind is open and expansive, to be aware when our mind is scattered among a million things, and to be aware when our mind is focused, which is different from being constricted. You see, they sound sort of similar, but they're in fact very, very different. These kinds of awarenesses help us extremely to behave skillfully in the world. If we're aware that we're angry, that we are in a negative mental state, that can help us to avoid acting out on it. On the other hand, most of the time when we're angry, I think, certainly if we haven't been practicing, most of the time we're angry, we're not really aware that we're angry, as it's not something right in front of us. I mean, the anger has taken us over so much that we're acting simply as a sort of a reflex from the anger. On the other hand, if we're mindful of the anger, that may be enough for us to be able to overcome it, or at least to be able to, let's say, walk out of the room rather than doing something rash. If we know that our mind is contracted around some issue that's annoying us, then that will be some spur to us if we're thinking straight enough to be able to say, look, my mind is really being constricted here. Now, why don't I just go out and take a walk? So again, a very, very important part of mindfulness, to be aware of the quality of the mind. And finally is mindfulness of what is called Damas. Damas is a very big catch-all term. In this context, it means certain kind of mental states understood in a Buddhist context, that is to say, understood in the categories that the Buddha outlined. Let me make this a little clearer. So for example, one of the parts of mindfulness of Damas is to be aware of the hindrances when they arise. Now, I've got an earlier talk on the hindrances, which I'll try to remember to put in a card up here if you're interested in hearing more about them. But roughly speaking, those are the things that hinder our meditative mind and also hinder us in daily life, such as ill will, sense pleasure, tiredness, restlessness and worry, or such as doubt. And there's going to be some overlap here with the case of mindfulness of mind, but here it's being aware of them as hindrances. Rather than just being aware that the mind is, let's say, in a state of ill will, we're aware of them as a hindrance. It's, that we're aware that we're doing something, that our mind is in a state that is going to make a meditation difficult, let's say. We're aware of the five aggregates, the aggregate of form, that is to say the body, the aggregate of feeling, which we just discussed, the aggregate of sensation, of perception, that is to say being aware of things in the world, the aggregate of sankhara, or of states of volition, of wanting to do something, of emotion. Sankharas also include emotions, which are spurs to action. They're kinds of elements of the will. Or the element of consciousness, which is something of an element of awareness, let's say. To be aware of these as the parts that constitute who we are as much as we can say anything does. Who we are is this kind of blooming, buzzing confusion, this process of these five aggregates sort of interrelated, coming into being and passing away every moment, or changing in every moment. Being aware also of the 6 internal and external sense spheres, which are the sight, hearing, tasting, feeling, smelling, and the 6th is the mental sphere, which in Buddhist psychology is understood as another kind of sense sphere. And understand that those things are just always in contact, insofar as we're conscious of them, always in contact with parts of the world. And again, all that we know is this kind of confusion of these different sense spheres. And also the awareness of what are called the awakening factors, which I won't get into in detail here, but they are factors that we strive for, that we make effort towards as we're practicing, such as joy, such as tranquility, such as equanimity. These kinds of positive states are ones that we should become aware of when they arise within us, and becoming aware of them as part of the path that shows the path's fruition is, I think, important. And finally, the Buddha says that we're to become aware of the Four Noble Truths, I think this is sort of, in a certain sense, getting ahead of ourselves, because awareness of the Four Noble Truths is I think, really in a relatively advanced practice. Of course, we're all aware of them as concepts, or many of us are aware of them as concepts. The truth that the universe is dukkha, that is to say, is unsatisfactory in some sense. The truth that unsatisfactory nature of reality comes from our tending to grasp at things that are always changing. The third one being that there is an escape from this. And the fourth being that the Eightfold Path is that escape. So obviously, as we're getting, again, way ahead of ourselves here, as we're getting closer to the end, where we're going to become more and more aware of the Four Noble Truths as lived realities, as we see the Eightfold Path leading to a kind of fruition. And so the Buddha calls this satipatthana, or these kinds of aspects, the 4 aspects of mindfulness practice, to be, as he calls it, the direct path to awakening, to realization. That is, this is a practice, this expansive, complex practice that I've only just touched on right here, is a practice that in a sense, on its own, will take us where we want to be. We have to be a little careful with that, though, because if we're going to really say that this is going to be, this is the direct path, then we have to be cognizant that this path is very complicated, that it has many, many aspects to it, that it's not just simply sitting and following the breath. That may be the beginning, that may be the foundation, that may be something we return to again and again. But there's very, very many aspects that the Buddha outlines when he talks about satipatthana, mindfulness practice. Now, finally, I'd like to recommend a couple of books for anybody who's interested in reading a lot further or deeper about these things. One of them I recommended in an earlier video of mine. It's Analayo's Satipatthana, The Direct Path to Realization. And that's an absolutely fantastic book. It was Analayo's PhD dissertation, I believe, which he then rewrote slightly into a book. I don't have my copy right here, but I'll try to remember to put a picture of it up on the screen. Otherwise, I'll also try to put a card up here which will link to that earlier video of mine, where I discuss that as one of the books that I would recommend very, very highly. Secondly, this fantastic book by Joseph Goldstein called Mindfulness. Many of you, again, may know about it. Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Awakening. What Joseph Goldstein did here was to take Analayo's book and basically, if you like, translate it into a much easier, more digestible kind of format. Analayo's is the original. It's a little bit, it's like something that's been highly, highly concentrated. It's not that long, a couple hundred pages maybe, I don't remember exactly. This one, on the other hand, is significantly longer, but it's easier to read if you prefer something that's less, move the camera here, a little less, a little bit less scholastic or academic. So that, my friends, is a very, very quick introduction to the 7th of the Eightfold Path, the 7th aspect of the Eightfold Path, right mindfulness. Very, very quick introduction. As you can see, there's a huge amount here. And so what I may have just done for many of you is just to name a bunch of things without really bringing them all together. And if that's the case, I'm sorry. Let me know in the comments. I'd be interested to know. But if you want to know more, there's plenty of places you can read more. And in future videos, I may go into some of this in more detail because there's so much more to be said about all of these things. But since this is such an important part of contemporary practice, mindfulness practice is so important nowadays. It's something that I think it would do us really well to actually go back and look at this early text, look at the complexity of it, look at the richness there, and contemplate whether our practice really lives up to that kind of complexity and richness. And to the extent that it doesn't, maybe think about adding some things to our practice, our daily practice, adding some kinds of practices from this early text, because I think that every last one of them is useful in some way or other. So I hope this has been useful for you, hearing a bit about mindfulness. If you're new to the podcast, I'm really glad you're here. I hope that this was comprehensible. If you're coming back again, then welcome back. And I hope you'll consider subscribing if you aren't already a subscriber. That's something that'll, I think, make your life easier. You'll see more of these probably. And we'll catch you on the next one. So, bye-bye.